Hello, dreamers! Welcome back to another Hallowoods weekly Q&A, behind-the-scenes live stream extravaganza affair. Thank you for tuning in, as always, not only to the show, but also to little bonus features like this. If you're watching here in the present, welcome. You can click over to the YouTube chat. There's a little chat bar. Feel free to drop questions and commentary in there throughout the stream. Once I am through the very short list of patron questions, then I will answer any questions in there that I can that are around. Secondly, if you're watching this in the far and distant future, well, the opportunity for this particular stream has passed, but you can always drop questions in the patrons ask box, where I'm able to keep questions that people answer and stockpile them and then answer them on streams like this. So that said, it has been a busy week behind the scenes for the Hallowoods, mostly because I am flying out for Gen Con very shortly. Which means that, I will be gone from the desk for nearly 2 weeks, which is going to mean that we do not have any more upcoming Q&A live streams for these next 2 weeks or so. You'll see the next one when I'm back at the desk. That'll get scheduled. But in the meantime, we're still trying not to take any more breaks, which means that I have essentially been busy cramming in as many episodes writing that I can, in an attempt to get everything sort of written and recorded and sized up for the weeks that I will be gone. That way, there's no interruption in the content that you folks are getting week to week, outside of a couple missed Q&A live streams. So we should, I think, it's been a real close call, and I've just been working overtime to try and make production ends meet. But I think we'll be in good shape, and I think we'll have episodes coming out each week that I am away from the desk over working at Gen Con. So that will be extremely exciting. And it will be a great trip. I don't often dip down to the US. So that'll be a fun time on its own. And on top of that, it's a place where many other podcasters also gather. So I'll probably run into some familiar faces or faces that you've caught me on streams with while I am there. Especially the crew that works in the Triangle Agency. I was part of a sort of a one-shot episode trying to promote the premiere of that game. It's an RPG. It's about sort of supernatural caseworkers whose job is to go contain anomalies, these creatures that are pits in reality, and they all have their strange quirks and ways that they bend our understanding of the universe. But every player is also an anomaly, themselves employed by the agency that hunts these down. So you all get your own supernatural office worker stuff that you can do. It's a delightful game. It has some of the best, most innovative game mechanics that I've ever seen in an RPG. But a number of the crew will be down there from that stream and from that game. Since Gen Con is a board games convention and that is a tabletop game, so it tracks. That said, yes, it will be, I think, essentially during that trip, I'll still probably be putting some polishing up on episodes that are in the works, in the pipeline. But the hope is to have a lot of work done before I fly out. So that is sort of my big rush for especially the rest of today and for tomorrow. Just trying to tidy up as much of that work as I can. And that said, I think we'll manage to pull it off without any major breaks, as far as I'm aware. Stay tuned over the next week or two just in case, but I think we'll pull it off. So that should be excellent. And we are getting into the weeds of the last 10-ish episodes now here in season 4. So there is a lot to cover. a lot to cover. I am just looking at the increasingly small list of episodes that remain, and mathing out like just how much content can be squeezed into each one, and how rapidly things will escalate from here as we begin to get into some big moments for a lot of these different storylines that we're chasing. Definitely this week was a fun episode to work on. The because the this last one has a couple things that I've been waiting for the season to kind of meet and finally happen. And so there's just so much ground to cover over these last like 8 to 10 episodes of the show for this season, anyways. Um, and that is really mainly the focus right now is just getting us through the end of the season. Definitely this big chunk of work that I'm doing now to compensate for the break behind the scenes will put us a lot closer to that too. So we are rolling towards, the finale is not quite here, but it is like in the near distance now. And in more, I think in more like lengthy seasons, because some of our seasons have been 48 episodes long. This one is only 30. So in some seasons, we would already be in the finale pretty much. I think we're not quite there yet, but we are getting into it very, very shortly. And so there's a lot of chaos that is in usual Hallowoods fashion, a lot to keep track of, behind the scenes, characters and motivations and plans and schemes all interwoven and interlaid over each other. But that said, it'll be a lot of fun to begin to give you the things to unravel everything and make sense of what this season has been. I definitely look forward to. So, that said, that is kind of the big priority goal right now. And I imagine even after returning from this trip, that will really be the continued focus for the near future. Because just it's important to put as much as I can into delivering a cool end to the season. And then immediately after the trip, I'm sure there will also be the stages of getting into the real nitty gritty of the planning for next season, because we are aiming for a very short turnaround time. Our current last I checked, we have like 3 weeks of break between this season and the next one. So that said, that's not a lot of time, and there's a lot of planning that's probably required going into this next one. So that we will see. I think whether that remains the scheduled release date or whether it ends up moved. But it's quite possible we'll just sail in with kind of 3 weeks of break time between this and the next. That said, there is a good bit of kind of planning, building that will go into the next season. And part of the difficulty of having begun to change the format of the show, to experiment a little bit more with doing a particular thing for a particular season. Part of that also means that there's more work up front because, for 150 episodes of the Hallowoods, more or less, or at least 140 some, there is, I think, yeah, for a good chunk of the Hallowoods, a lot of the sounds of the show, of the layout of the show, is very similar. In terms of sound effects, in terms of sound design, there's a lot of assets that you hear every episode, and those are things that I don't have to reinvent or change, because we're still rolling within the same framework. Whereas when we do big format changes like this, then everything gets redesigned from scratch a little bit. And so, this season has demanded a particular format, and that comes with its own sounds and its own work and its own days of like figuring out how stuff is going to sound. So there will be a lot of work on that end for the next season, I'm sure, in addition to getting the structure and the format of it and kind of the story that it is specifically trying to tell, mathed out in a much more concrete way. As usually happens in the last couple of months of creating whichever season is current, is usually when the real planning tends to begin for the season that comes after, beyond just like my notes and rough drafts and concepts. So that said, there's a lot on the horizon, and really the end of season 4 coming up each month as we get a little bit closer. So it'll be, I think, a lot of fun. Although also a lot of stress on the audience, because we are in some stressful places right now with a good few of our cast members. But I can't wait to see the rest of this paper unicorn unfold. That said, we do have one question in our patrons ask box this week. Then I will get to any that have popped up in chat. So LM asks, Lucius asks, do you have any podcast / TV / show / book recommendations for Hallowoods fans? I'm so obsessed with I Love Hallowoods right now that I have a hard time getting invested in anything else. Ooh, this is a difficult question for me because I don't. A lot of the media I consume is very random, and I don't have a lot of great equivalents for like things that are going on in the Hallowoods specifically. So it's a scattered bunch of recommendations. As always, although I hesitate to recommend it because if you're into fiction podcasts, you probably already have gotten into other shows of its caliber. But the Siltverses just finished their big finale, the end of the show. Their seasons are up. Their story has been told and buttoned, and John and Muna are done. So if you haven't already, it is an excellent time to go check out the Siltverses. It's been a real pleasure to get to voice, I think, 1 or 2 background characters in a certain scene, but then for the last 2 seasons, to have gotten to play sort of a minor character named Chuck Harm, a sort of a terrible Tucker Carlson style news reporter, and hear his interpretation of the world and all that's unfolding in it. He's a terrible guy, but it's been so much fun to get to play, and the writing that he's gotten to go through for this last season was just beautiful. Definitely one of my favorite roles that I've gotten to play in a podcast, and thrilled to have been just a very small part of this wonderfully crafted show. If you haven't listened to it already, The Siltverses is a show about the acolytes of a forbidden god called the Trawler Man. And they live in a world where gods are a fairly mundane part of society, but also a terrible part of society. Their eldritch power and their unique flavors are constantly seeping into the world and changing it. And they prey and feed on devotion and are powered by faith. Which means that you have these very real cosmic forces that can be called upon by the humblest and greatest of faith of their acolytes. So it is a fascinating sort of god punk world, and really cool to see. It is. I'm not completely caught up on it, the Siltverses, but it's been one of my favorite listens. In terms of other podcasts that are rolling in this space, the other kind of not quite equivalent, but very much in in the vein of our current like show layout. Malevolent is, I think, doing the numbers right now, really making its paces. And I think I'm not sure that it really comes close to eclipsing the Magnus Protocol, which is Rusty Quill's new Magnus Archives sequel. But it's definitely cracking into the public perception in a big way. Malevolent, if you've enjoyed any of the sort of detective-y shenanigans that we've gotten into, Malevolent is about a private eye who's sort of becomes the host for an eldritch entity, which is good for him because he loses his vision, and the eldritch entity can provide instructions. And so they have to go uncover some terrible eldritch case, get involved with cultists and traveling through dream realms and all sorts of terrible things that lie ahead. And especially recently, it's been kind of reputed for just beautiful writing and complicated storytelling and a, a grasp of characters that will have you both very concerned for them and also aware of all their flaws at the same time, which I think is difficult to do. It is all voiced and composed and written by Harlan Guthrie, who is we've collaborated on a number of things at this point. But that's if you're looking for a show to get into where you can listen along, be caught up with the latest, and then also have other fans out there making fan work and fan fiction and talking about the show and making art. That's definitely a show to look at. Personally, like the Hallowoods community is very, very dedicated to this teeny tiny show, but also, it moves at a fairly slow pace, I think, in terms of the fandom. We haven't really been flooded with, online like fame in the same way that some shows have. So you find it a pretty laid back like atmosphere in the Hallowoods fandom for the most part, whereas some of these shows that are gaining a lot of mainstream attention tends to have also, I think, a more active but sometimes also more like a busy fan base. But that said, I think in terms of other shows, another that comes to mind, possibly worth a check, would be Ealer's Choice. This was an indie show that came out fairly recently. It's about hunting giant eels, giant whale-like eels. There's a little bit of storm magic in there. There's, crews of hardened sailors and novices and fumble-fingered mages riding on boats. It was fun to be in this show just for you'll hear a snippet of me in the back sometimes being like, "Oh, the yardarm!" But it was a fun show to be a part of, and also a fairly short and contained one. If you're not looking for like another 100 and some episode commitment, that one I think was just like 8 or 12 episodes and done, in its season. I think there might be more on the way sometime. I think it was pretty well received. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more bound out eventually. But that said, that was also just a neat little show that cropped up recently. In terms of TV shows, the truth is I don't catch a great deal of television, especially not recently. I think I'm always stealing notes from certain things. I'm especially things that I watched a long time ago and have a real hazy memory of. I remember being at one point kind of into the show The Magicians. I think I was into the book a little bit more. But it's a show about a magical college. And I think what was impressed upon me, there's certainly like a little bit of that franchise that made its way into the way that Downing Hill works. Because the other magical schools that you see in literature tend to be a little bit more preppy and mystical and fun and like, oh, we're going on an adventure. Oh, we have to sit and learn potions class. And oh, what do? But The Magicians it's a lot. It's not a gritty take exactly, but it raises the question that magic is extremely dangerous, and that if you don't know what you're doing with it, you can harm yourself, corrupt yourself, radiate yourself with it, and that can have terrible effects. It has one of my favorite villains that I've ever seen in anything. I think he's the Beast. He has a face that is masked by moths at all times. He is an example of what happens when someone overreaches themselves and exposes themselves to magic that they have no hope of controlling and becomes kind of twisted by it. And he's delightful. And they made him a little bit less mysterious in the show, but they filled in his personality so well that he's delightful in a very different way in the television adaptation. And as they say in chat, versus the magicians where everyone has so much trauma, yes, everyone there has some kind of personal complex because only kind of messed up people would set themselves on a path to learn magic in the first place. But on top of that, the act of learning how to control this stuff is deeply harmful and breaks apart your relationships, and power corrupts, and you find yourself clawing over your friends for just a little bit more. And that is the situation that the magicians kind of presented. And I loved that take, that much darker take on what a university where you learn magic looks like. And so I definitely was taking notes from that when looking at Downing Hill's character, that this would be an institution where students were not safe, where every day is a unique test of your character by beings that you do not completely understand the nature of. And that the very highest people, the people who had elevated themselves the most, within this organization, are also the people who are the furthest from being human. The people who have sacrificed so much of themselves and let magic seep in through the cracks that they are something very strange and alien in its way of thought, to how people usually operate. Elliot, to my beloved, says the chat. I think Elliot I think even before I came out, Elliot was one of those iconic, like, queer characters that really just captured my attention, and I saw a lot of myself in at the time. So props to the magicians for having that as well. And again, the TV show just elevated that to a completely lovely level. Still very fond memories of that character. So yeah, I think that show shaped a lot of why Downing Hill is so like orderly. Like, a lot of the dynamics of the school are not so much just attending classes and learning stuff and sitting down and like a scheduled career path, but it is a series of tests that are set up to test your commitment and to break you and to figure out what makes you tick so that they can heighten your ability, often by taking advantage of the things that you fear or are insecure about or are afraid of. And so a lot of, I think, Downing Hill's kind of malicious, but at the same time neutral approach, not born out of disliking you, but doing harmful things in order to make you stronger. I think was a lot of the precedent behind that school, and we see it a lot in different ways in the staff, especially that runs Downing Hill. The director, I think, is kind of one path. Henry O'Connor, slightly different in that he hasn't. There's something that he hasn't quite given up yet, and as a result, that creates a divide between him and the school eventually. So that show had some varied influences for sure. I think a certain amount of obviously, like I think having seen a season or two of The Walking Dead, definitely it's a edgy little show early on, and I think I really enjoyed the way that there would be a dynamic of survivors working together, but you also wouldn't necessarily know who was going to make it. There was this feeling that you had relationships between characters that would sort of blossom and thrive in this hardship, and then people would be taken away very suddenly. And you were never quite sure, especially at first, who was going to be on that list. So I think a little bit of that goes into eventually the scout post into these kind of post apocalyptic communities. Um, Slightly a little bit of like Mad Max Fury Road as well. We don't spend a lot of time with the actual like communities that remain in the United States, but I loved that in Fury Road you get a lot of they have like a couple of different cities or towns pretty much. Gas Town, Bullets Town, something like that, the Bullet Farm, that's it. And these essentially are based around providing a resource that to still make it accessible past the apocalypse. And so we get a little bit of hints throughout the Hallowoods in a couple of the local events monologues, I think, about how who's still providing gasoline in this day and age, how commerce is working, like how certain resources, how food, how salvage is still functional, and what kind of like offbeat communities are responsible for making those. We also stop in season two at Glass City Farms, and this is kind of one example of a community that has banded around trying to provide some kind of boon or benefit or product to the like surrounding, but then often those communities themselves have their own issues or dark secrets. So there's a couple of inspirations that have factored into that sort of post-apocalyptic front of the Hallowoods. um, yeah, I think in terms, if you, as far as TV shows go, if you get much into animation, especially Over the Garden Wall, you'll definitely find some roots of the Hollywoods there too. And that, if you haven't seen it, is a lovely show. It's also a very short watch, but it I think inspired a lot of the Hallowoods kind of folk horror elements, a lot of the forest horror, and I really enjoyed. I had never really seen before how Over the Garden Wall took horror elements and presented them in a kid-friendly Cartoon Network limited series, complete with cute music, but at the same time, had this deeply chilling story and had these folk horror elements that were very visceral. And so it was a fascinatingly weird little piece of work, but it definitely played. I think right about after I had seen that is when ideas started pouring out for the early drafts of the Hallowoods. And a lot of my early animation type illustrations for characters were very steeped in kind of that Cal Arts style, trying to figure out how a character would move or look in the space. Um, and so I that show remains an inspiration, and there remains characters in it that I would love to sort of take some note from as I continue on that I haven't really gotten the chance to do yet. So those are all inspirations. I think yeah, another troubled one to mention, because definitely the author Neil Gaiman has had some terrible allegations recently. But a novel that years ago had kind of I think provided a lot of literary inspiration, and the TV adaptations were quite good. Was American Gods. And that had a lot of road trip aspects I would later bake into the second season of the Hallowoods. Um, and also presented mythology and fantastical beasts and creatures in a very sort of casual way, in a very sort of urban way, I guess. The idea that gods or these people of import that you meet on a cosmic level could be, people that you come into a room and see that run like a dive bar somewhere that invite you into their house to stay for a night. And definitely when dealing with semi mythological type places and creatures, it's definitely had some grounding inspirations on places like the Resting Place Hotel, on people like the Count. Trying to figure out what some of these myths and horror archetypes would look like when like baked into a fairly I hesitate to call the Hallowoods grounded, but like baked into the very gritty like reality of a world that is kind of experiencing this supernatural upset. Um, I think, yes, book recommendations. I recently read Our Wives Under the Sea, which is a sapphic horror novel in which the wife of a deep sea exploration researcher, um, her wife, this researcher, goes on a mission. It was only supposed to last for like 2 weeks and is gone for like 8 months. And this wife doesn't know why. And then her wife returns one day from the ocean, changed somehow. And so it's definitely up the alley for people who like the help my spouse is becoming an eldritch horror side of things. And I think although it's not terribly brief, it's more of an emotional novel than a horrifying one, I think. But some of the body horror, especially with his wife who's returned from this terrifying deep sea ordeal, really left a lasting impression. And I think is definitely had some things to take forward when it comes to my own writing for some of these sort of horrifyingly transformed characters. And it was just a very pretty book overall, one that meditates a lot, I think, on loss, but also the act of giving up on someone that you are losing, which felt very topical to the kind of storylines that we're seeing here in season 4. So all these are just little bits and pieces that I take things from, and like any author, I'm always just looking for things that catch my attention and dynamics that I think are interesting and poetic bits of stories, and then always just trying to take something beautiful from them and then put it out into some other different shape, and presenting that out to the world with this story. So that said, I think that will bring us to the end of our live stream for today. So thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Hope you enjoy your weeks off from these Q&As, and we will catch you on the flip side after a couple more episodes of Hello from the Hallowoods Season 4. Take care, everyone. Take care, and see you around the bend.